every once in a while, you'll have an experience that reminds you that people's parents and grandparents led the most wild and amazing lives. And if they don't tell the stories, they die with the stories. It's the Bob and
the Bob
Sheri
and Sheri
Oddcast.
Oddcast. The Bob and Sheri
The Bob and Sheri
Oddcast.
Oddcast.
Come on in, you'll have a blast.
You'll have a blast.
With the Bob and Sheri
With the Bob and Sheri Oddcast. We really need to lean on our friend Jimmy Wayne or Ethan Thompson or somebody to sing the Oddcast jingle for us, like in a professional way, and then we can just play it, because I feel like we're only getting worse at it, not better. All right,
we're in different locations, so it's not totally our fault.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and there's nothing that can be done for me. I'm so off key and off pitch. But anyway, Max and I both got a DM in our Twitters from one of our listeners named Clayton. And he wrote, "My grandfather was a child during World War II here in Jackson, Tennessee. And Jackson used to be known as a big railroad hub. The German POWs who were brought to America were distributed and transported from Jackson. My grandfather used to go to the train yard and poke and make fun of the Nazis for being captured. Some of the American soldiers going off war would be riding on the train through Jackson, and they weren't allowed to leave the train. So my grandfather had his mother make him an apron for him and his best friend, and they would go, and the soldiers would pay them money to take their letters and mail them out to their loved ones."
Wow.
There's a lot to unpack in that story. So I've managed to go my whole life up to this point, having never encountered someone whose grandparent or family member would poke and taunt Nazis. How about you? Just for starters.
I agree with you. It's just so interesting how that era, World War II, after 75, 80 years, still has, because it was just so horrific and so defining. It defined America so strongly. There are still stories to be told. It's just remarkable. Like the thing I did on Things Bob Didn't Know a few days ago about how some Nazis, soldiers, were brought to the United States and put in prison here. But if they were not the sort of people that were untrustworthy, maybe they were just German soldiers, young men that got told, you have to do this or we'll shoot you. They were taken to places like Chicago and other cities, and they were allowed to go to the movies, to go out to restaurants. They had minimum supervision. Now, when they were going to these places, there was usually a minder who was an American soldier, but their lives weren't all that bad, and some of them actually stayed here. I had no idea that was the case.
I have a talkback message I'm going to play from a listener.
Hi, Bob and Sheri. This is Josie from North Carolina. You guys were talking about German POWs the other day, and there were a lot of German POWs in Wisconsin during World War II, and my grandparents hired some of them to work on their dairy farm, and they stayed in touch with a couple of them throughout the years, and when they visited Germany to visit some long-lost relatives, they actually went and saw the POWs that worked on their farm, and they had nothing but good things to say about them. But just thought I'd share that little tidbit. Love listening to you guys.
Isn't that something?
Like the more you learn, right? It's a fascinating part of American history.
Yeah, you wonder
it's just fascinating.
What the German people. I'm not going to call them all Nazis. They're not. But you wonder what the German soldiers who went back home, what they thought of this American family they worked for, because it sounded like the American family didn't work them like slaves. That they had a decent period. You wonder if they say to their friends, what a shame on us for having fought people as good as this.
I think that in some cases what you just said is probably the exact truth. I know there are stories and documented cases of those soldiers falling in love and staying here and becoming American citizens, right? I mean, there's quite a bit of that. So
there's more of American soldiers overseas finding someone and becoming husband and wife. I've never really known of somebody who married a former German soldier. I'm sure it happened, but I've never heard of it personally.
Well, Clayton, who had DM'd us about his granddad, said there's a book called Tales and Trails of Tennessee, and there's a whole chapter about the Nazis in Tennessee, which is just like a little pocket of history that is almost forgotten. Let's pause here and we'll come right back.
Do you own or rent your home? Sure you do, and I bet it can be hard work sometimes. You know it's easy? Bundling policies with Geico.
Geico makes it easy to bundle your homeowners or renter's insurance along with your auto policy, and that's a good thing too because you already have so much to do around your home. Go to geico.com, get a quote, and see how much you could save. It's Geico easy. Visit geico.com today. That's geico.com. All right, so we're back talking about the really, honestly, in some cases, the wild lives that grandparents and great-grandparents and parents lived. And, you know, a lot of times they don't share these stories, in part because some of these older generations were not as self-absorbed maybe as we are. You know, they didn't have social media, you know, they weren't constantly holding up a mirror to their own lives. It was just a different time and people were different. I think about some of the stories that my older family members told me when I was a kid. And I think back on it now and go, wow, you lived a life. And we don't know really much about it because those stories weren't shared and weren't told. Like, Bob, how much did your dad ever really talk to you about his experience in war?
Very few. I remember like 5 big stories, and that was about it. I really wish I had just sat down with him and said, "Tell me about exactly how it was. Tell me about the Battle of the Bulge. Did you meet Patton? Did you have a hard time being a 19-year-old sergeant telling older men what to do?" But you're in such a rush when you're a young person to get to wherever you think you need to be, that it's not till later that you reflect on gaining knowledge of what your people were all about. I really, really, really am sorry about that. I'm sorry I never met my mother's father. He died very young. I wish I had just said, well, tell me what Jack was all about. And she told me a couple of things, that he would take her horseback riding in East Rock, which is a park in New Haven. And I never knew that. But I never got any more details. If there's a young person listening right now and you have a grandfather who maybe was in Vietnam, or even if he wasn't, or she wasn't. Desert Storm,
Yeah.
Be sure to ask them about it, because very often, especially with the World War II generation, the greatest generation, I don't know if there was some sort of a directive the day they got out, but none of those guys said shit when they got back home. It was just little pieces here and little pieces there, but there was absolutely no, I did this and that's why you'll do this. You wouldn't be here if not. I never heard one of my father's older friends ever say anything like that.
It wasn't until my father became elderly did he even talk about it with me. I mean, seriously, he never mentioned it.
I read an article, and it was either in like the Atlantic or maybe Vanity Fair a couple of years ago, about this very phenomenon. Why did the greatest generation take their stories with them when they left this world? And a lot of it is cultural, and a lot of it has to do with trauma and the fact that it's only very recently that we understand how traumatized our combat veterans are, that
Right.
we have a name for it, combat PTSD, and that we're prepared to treat it and meet these returning soldiers with mental health, with an appropriate response. For the soldiers of the World War I and World War II eras, that didn't exist. And they saw and witnessed absolute horror, unspeakable evil and horror. And they were kids, a lot of them, and they came back home to the United States. And this article was specifically about World War II. They came back to the United States thoroughly traumatized. But there was the GI Bill, an opportunity to get a college education. And here suddenly the American suburbs are exploding, and a soldier can return home from war and go to college and buy a car and a home and just kind of get on with it. And there was a sort of a collective, let's just get on with it mentality that some people would say, and that's how it should be. But part of the reason that those men never told those stories is because those stories were so deeply and profoundly traumatic that they've just boxed them up and put them away.
Oh,
I
I
know
have a
that's not true in
relative.
every case, but that's what this article said.
I have a relative who fought in the Iraqi war, and he's on disability right now. And some of it's physical, but some of it's mental too. And doesn't talk about it very much. But one of his siblings said he killed a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, that's what war is. War is hell, but of course, Hollywood, as part of the propaganda movement and the drive to get everyday regular citizens on board with, rationing and getting women into the workforce and munitions plants and all. That's where that whole war is swell movement came from, because
Right.
we need it on the home front. We needed to make some pretty extraordinary sacrifices during World War II. Sacrifices that I'm not sure Americans would be able or willing to make today, if we're just being honest. I mean, I don't know that Americans are going to give up sugar or ration their fruit or any other damn thing that had to be done in World War II. So it was a different time, and a completely those soldiers left a different America than we live in today and came home to a different America. But as a result, we don't have their stories. We
I
don't
think
know
some of
what
it
those
was
experiences were like.
the PR of the military and Hollywood together also. Because if you came back and you saw something horrific over there, then how do you feel about the John Wayne movies? Now, here's a guy that did not serve in the service. I'm not saying he should have, and maybe age would have kept him out of it, but he didn't do the USO thing that I know of, like Hope did. But when you see his movies, this is a guy that is fighting the Japanese and fighting the Germans, and he's not saying too much about what he's going through. He's just being a soldier and being the quiet, brave American. So if you came back and you have these images in your mind and you go to see The Flying Tigers starring John Wayne as Pappy Boyington, there's no sensitivity to him. It was shoot down those Japs and get on with it. Put a cigarette in your mouth, close the cockpit. Actually, I guess you would do it the other way. Open the cockpit and put a cigarette in your mouth, and don't talk about it. I think that whole image of the American soldier, especially during World War II, was propagated in part by Hollywood.
If you want it was. I mean, the Hollywood. There was a government film. Like there was a liaison between the government and the Department of Defense and Hollywood. And there were people in the film industry who that's how they served. Like in
John
the draft,
Ford.
like that is how they served. If you want to watch a movie about World War II, a classic movie about World War II that will open your eyes. There's an old movie. It's a legendary movie called The Best Years of Our Lives. It came out in the mid 1940s. I think maybe 1945, 1946. No, it's not Jimmy Stewart. It was directed by William Wyler, and it starred a real life some real life soldiers. It was Myrna Loy, Frederick March.
The guy's name was Harold something, and I'll tell you who it. If you give me a second, it was
Harold Russell. Wasn't it Harold Russell?
That's exactly who it is.
So here's the plot of The Best Years of Our Lives. I've seen this movie 3 or 4 times. It shows up on Turner Classic a lot. So it follows 3 veterans who are coming home at the end of World War II to this town in the Midwest. One of them was a bombardier captain. One of them was in the Navy. One of them was an infantry sergeant. And one of them, before he shipped out, the sergeant, was like a soda jerk, which for those of us who weren't around back then worked at a drugstore making milkshakes or whatever. Anyway,
that is what my father did. My father was a soda jerk in Hamden, Connecticut, and then joined to fight the Germans.
So he got married right before he shipped out. And then another guy was a banker And then the third one, Homer, was this star teenage athlete. And he lived with his mom and dad. He was a star high school athlete, and he lived next door to his girlfriend. And during the war, he lost both arms, and he comes home with these prosthesis. The movie is so moving, and it really shows you the difficulty of that each of these men has adjusting to life stateside after the war. You've got Homer, who is dealing with his disability. You've got one of the men who has a problem with drinking. You've got another man, and this was really bold and new for Hollywood. This is 1946, and one of the men is experiencing flashbacks from his bombing raids, and he's having difficulty in his marriage. I mean, he's full on got PTSD, even though we didn't have a name for it. It ended up winning all these Academy Awards. And it's just an incredible, like you'll watch it with tears streaming down your face. I think that might have been the first, and check my math on this, Max, but I think that might have been the first movie that showed that there was more to war than guts and glory.
It was. In fact, I believe Harold Russell won an Oscar for his performance in that.
That's good that Hollywood did that. You know, I always felt that the children, the baby boomers, were disserved by Hollywood. Their parents fought, you know, they might have had a relative who was killed, but the War is Swell movies that baby boomers went to see when they were 10, 12, 15, 18 years old, like The Dirty Dozen. It was just a slew of these movies where there'd be one or two Americans that would be killed during whatever the battle was, but not that many. And the Americans would always succeed in vanquishing the Japanese enemy or the Nazis. So you grew up thinking, you know, maybe the old man was a hero, and it didn't look that bad. If they had shown Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan, as a kid, you would have had a whole different experience in your head.
Well, at the time, the way that Hollywood was working in conjunction with the War Office, right? The goal was completely different.
Yep. No, those are two different periods that you're talking about. They were working to get recruits and to get Americans behind the war. But once the war was over, like around 1958, 1960, all these color movies came out that just glamorized it. And they're still on TV today.
That's what made this movie, The Best Years of Our Lives, so groundbreaking and surprising. I can't even imagine. Of course, none of us were alive at that time, but what must that movie have been like when it hit theaters in 1946? Because no one had seen a depiction of war or military service or soldiers coming home from war that was so kind of raw and real and harrowing. That was a first. What must that have been like?
Good for the producers. I'll bet there were some men who went to see it and were offended.
You know, it's interesting. Harold Russell, I just saw this. He did win by the Best Supporting Actor and for that, but he also won another Oscar for that performance. The Academy wasn't sure he would win, so they created an award for all of the work he had done in bringing comfort to so many soldiers who had disabilities prior to this film being released. So he won 2 Oscars for the same performance, and it's the only time that's ever happened.
Oh, wow. That's pretty good. How about that?
So I was looking to see if I could find like a moose paper. A moose paper is a newspaper for moose. I was looking for if I could find like a movie review that had been published of this back in the day, and I have not been able to. It's all like looking back, like Roger Ebert looking back and all of that. But when you watch this movie, and if you've not seen it, I hope you'll check it out the next time it shows up on Turner, or maybe you can find it on demand. When you watch this movie, you really have to remember that you're seeing something that was happening like for the first time in pop culture.
Yeah.
You were seeing that more true and real mirror being held up. And
Yeah. The
again,
horror of it.
these are our grandparents and our great grandparents, and they kept it so quiet. If I didn't have my Pup's love letters to my grandmother when he was like a teenager serving in the Navy in the Pacific Theater in World War II, I wouldn't have any idea what the heck he did during those years.
Yeah.
And his wife, Philadelphia was the big naval station. Back then, there was a huge naval base in Philly. It's since been kind of mothballed. Big base, big hospital, huge naval presence in Philadelphia. And so here comes the war, and the city just emptied out. Those sailors were all deployed. And
Right.
so a lot of the factories and jobs in the city suddenly needed workers. And my grandmother was one of those women. She was like 20 years old and a newlywed. My pup shipped out, and she got a job working at a factory and spent the entire wartime working at this factory. Just like an episode of I Love Lucy. It was Whitman's candy. It was a chocolate factory, just like the Lucy episode. And there are photos of her at that time looking like a black and white still from a Hollywood movie about the war. And if I had never asked her about it, because, I'd go through the old, like these shoe boxes of old photos that she had, and I'd be like, what is this? What are you doing in this one? If I had never asked her, she wouldn't have thought to tell me. It was just, it's a long time ago.
I know we're running out of time here, but I always felt badly for some of the English men during World War II. I was walking by a bookstore in Knightsbridge in London, and I looked, and right in the window they had this new release: Sex During World War II. I went, because I just never thought in terms of those people having the opportunity, having the time. It was before the sexual revolution of the 1960s in America. And I didn't buy it. But evidently there was a lot of premarital sex and casual sex that was going on. And I have heard from people who have been British people who had parents during that era saying that it was really hard for men to watch these young GIs come over to their country, because that's where you would go to stage to learn how to, better be a soldier and to get ready to be shipped over to Normandy or wherever it may be. You got 19, 20, 23, 24-year-old, good-looking, healthy American boys in uniform. If you're the local guy, that's pretty hard to compete with. And if you see one of your high school sweethearts arm in arm walking with one of these dashing young men, that had to be a real ball buster.
Well, I love that you thought that there was no premarital sex during that
I didn't say none, but there wasn't to the case to the point that we have it today.
There was a lot, but my grandmom told me, because my grandmom told me that my pup learned many filthy tricks in foreign ports as a sailor. And my grandmom told me that cunnilingus was invented in the 70s. Now, I think she's mistaken about that. I have a feeling
French.
It's been around a good bit longer than that. But my grandmom told me with a straight face. My grandmom said, I'll tell you what, the 70s came along and then suddenly it was just put your face anywhere. And I still laugh when I remember that conversation that I had with her. But we're, human beings. Human beings have always been human beings, and I can only imagine that wartime really amplified that. Like, you think about, I've heard stories and read stories from, like, real life stories from women who lived in military towns. And the soldiers would be on the base, and they would have like dances and mixers and social events. And you'd be slow dancing with these soldiers one right after another, because you knew you might be the last woman that boy held in his arms before being sent off to battle. Right.
Yeah,
and
true.
So there was a real heightened awareness of the preciousness of time and mortality, and how this moment might be the only moment And that was super, super heightened by the presence of war and the knowledge. These are people like in their late teens and early 20s. The knowledge that this boy that you're doing the foxtrot or whatever with, to Benny Goodman or what have you, this boy might be blown to smithereens in the next 14 days. Like, you don't know that. You don't know, right? Life was so precious, and those things mattered so much. And that is one thing. Once I got my grandparents talking a little bit, that was one thing that I really took away, was they understood in a way that maybe a lot of us don't, at such a visceral level. It is fleeting and nothing is promised. And so you grab for joy and pleasure where you can. And as my grandmother told me, because I have an aunt who was very popular with the boys, very popular. She was a couple years younger than my grandmother. And they would go to all these dances and I think the word was canteen that my grandmother used in Philly. And she said, you know, your Aunt so-and-so. She thought it was her patriotic duty, every sailor before he got on the ship. And I was like, oh my God. And my grandmother said, yeah.
Wow.
I love her, but such a whore.
I have to go because Hampton is here, and I just want to see if he's going to a mixer tonight.
Or a sock hop.
Yeah.
So there you go. Go ahead and ask your parents and grandparents. Get them to tell you some stories. Get them to tell you the stories now, so that you don't have to wonder what it was like for them when they were 16 and 25 and 30 and all of that. Get them to tell the stories now about Operation Desert Storm and all of the things that are happening in real time for us. That's going to be history for our kids. That's it for today's
And enjoy
Oddcast
Stardust by Tommy Dorsey.
It's Glenn Miller.
Glenn Miller? Okay.
New episodes every Monday and Friday. Our website is BOBANDSHERI.com. Y'all stay safe. Big loves and hugs. We'll see you next time on the Oddcast. Hey, thank you so much for listening to the Bob and Sheri podcast and the Bob and Sheri Oddcast. We would love if you would subscribe, rate and review, and share it with a friend on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you go. And thank you again for listening.